You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Okay, today we're back to talk about some more Civil War farm history. My name is Kendra Debany, and we're going to talk today a little bit about the Christian Shriver farm. Now, in previous podcasts, you were introduced to me. My name is Kendra Debany. I own Gettysburg House Histories. You can find me at Gettysburg House Histories, my page on Facebook. And what I want to do, if you've missed any of the earlier podcasts, what I want to do is talk a little bit about some of the houses and in the area, not only the Civil War history, but what was going on the farms throughout the years, from settlement all the way through to the current owners. Well, today, what we're going to do, I'm actually, our house today is actually going to be a house where I'm going to focus right in on the Civil War family who own this farm. This is actually the Christian Shriver farm, and this one was a lot of fun to do. There's a lot of oral history going on with this property. Again, with oral history, you always have to kind of take it with a little grain of salt that maybe some of the people are embellishing through the years, but in the absence of having nothing, something is better than nothing, I always say. So this one is full of oral history. And again, with this one, I'm going to continue with my ongoing theme, the battle beyond the borders. So we're going to talk about properties that sit just outside of the battlefield and the official park boundaries. Probably something you've never heard about. I want to teach you something new and get you out exploring something different. But as I mentioned previously, please don't be alarmed. We will discuss battlefield farms as well. The address for the property we're going to talk about today is 435 Chapel Road in Gettysburg in Cumberland Township. Again, it's 435 Chapel Road. It's the Christian Shriver farm. And here's something that I think would be of a lot of interest to a lot of you in knowing this house is actually for rent on Airbnb. So you can actually stay at this house. So if you like what you hear on the farm and you want to check it out and rent it, it is available for rent. And the owners of the property are spectacularly wonderful people. So highly recommend this one. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Christian Shriver and his farm and his family and the battle. Christian Shriver began his ownership of this property on March 31st, 1847, when he purchased the land from his father, George L. Shriver. While we don't know how much he paid or what the terms of the sale were, because a deed wasn't recorded, which in the early years you did not have to record a deed and you had to pay to have a deed recorded. So a number of people did not record their deeds, which is kind of a bummer for somebody like me who researches the history of houses. But what we do know is that at the time of his purchase, the property included 222 acres of land, a log house, a log barn, and what they call, quote, necessary outbuildings. So your smokehouse, your spring house, your outhouse, etc. Christian Shriver and his wife Alice had been married for nearly 7 years prior to moving to the farm. In their nearly 5 decades of living at the property, the Shrivers would experience every aspect of life, from the good, the bad, to the purely mundane, pretty much like what we do. Like many of the families at the time, Christian and Alice Shriver had experienced the devastating loss of some of their children in the years leading up to the battle. In 1842, their son John William passed away at the age of 2. In the 1850s, those were particularly hard years for the Shrivers, with the loss of their son Christian Fisher in 1853. He was only 8 months old. And their daughter Angeline in 1855, and she was only 1 year old. And then again in 1859, their daughter Sarah Jane died, and she was 14. The loss of so many children was quite common during this time period. And even though most parents expected at this time to lose children, it was still devastating when it actually happened, as you can imagine. Going off tangent here, but one of the properties that I had researched had suffered the loss of 2 sets of twins and 1 son within like a week and a half. So when some of these childhood diseases like scarlet fever, rubella, all of these early diseases, typhus, when these things came through, the death rate to the children was just horrific. Now, Christian Shriver, a little bit of background about him. He was a man of prominence in the local community. He was held in very high regard. Perhaps one of the most notable accomplishments was that he was instrumental in the inception of the Mount Joy Lutheran Church. This is actually on the Taneytown Road, south of Gettysburg, for anyone who doesn't know exactly where that is. Mr. and Mrs. Shriver were both charter members of that church, and the church is located not far from their farm. In 1852, Shriver served on the building committee for the church and helped to haul bricks and participate in construction of the structure. In 1852, 1859, and 1863, he also served as a church councilman. Throughout their lives, the Shrivers maintained an active interest in the church, and some of their children would do likewise. Another reason for Shriver's prominence stemmed from his substantial wealth. He owned a considerable amount of land, which was also in a very high state of cultivation. According to the 1860 federal census, he owned $11,000 worth of real estate and $2,000 in other assets. These would be things like cash, gold, stocks, bonds, which made him the 10th wealthiest man in Cumberland Township at the time. Now, when you consider $11,000, just to give you an idea about this, the average wealth of a person, or the average house, the value of a house of a person at this time period was, between $4,000 and $5,000, $4,500. So he owns $11,000 in real estate. So that kind of gives you an idea of his wealth. And in $2,000 in personal assets, most people in this time period, maybe 500, 300. So he is very wealthy. Between 1860 and 1861, the Shrivers decided that it was time to build a new house. So they built the new stone house that stands on the property today to replace the original 2-story log house, which had sat on the property for decades. The construction on this house was actually finished in late 1861, just in time to welcome the arrival of their son, Daniel Edwin, who was born in the house on March 8, 1862. He was the last of the child of Christian and Alice, and he was their last child and the only one to be born in the house. Now, because of his age, Christian Shriver did not enlist in the Federal Army when the war broke out, but according to family accounts, quote, he often assisted in cases of emergency, end quote. In June of 1863, the Shriver's son Lewis was drafted to fight in the Union Army. At the time of his enlistment on June 17, 1863, Lewis was 21 years old. He enlisted with a local cavalry unit, the 21st Pennsylvania Cavalry Company B, and was mustered into service on June 23, 1863, bringing along his own horse and equipment. Now, interesting, during the Battle of Gettysburg, his unit remained in the area and could claim participation in protecting their home turf during the campaign, which is a pretty big deal. If you lived here, it would have been nice to be able to protect your own home. He was honorably discharged from service on February 20th, 1864. Now, that was him. Now, in addition to Christian Shriver, who was 45 years old in 1863, The other members of his family living in the house at the time of the battle were his wife, Alice, who was 44, his sons, Henry, 20, Jacob, 16, George, 14, David, 12, Solomon, 7, Robert, 5, Benjamin, 3, and Daniel, 1. So lots of kids and all boys. At the time of the battle, the Shrivers still owned their 222 acres of land. Of this 222 acres of land, 132 acres were being farmed and 90 acres were in woodlands. So he has a high state of cultivation going on here. His production values were in 1850, 60, 70, they put out something called the Agricultural Census. So this is another census, but this one was taken not just of the people themselves, it was taken to find out more about their farm life and their farm production. So it would tell you how many acres he had, how much he was farming, the value of his farming equipment, the value of his livestock, what type of livestock he had, what kind of crops he was growing. Did he have a lot of butter? Did he sell some of his orchard produce at market? How much slaughtered meat he had? This is a really great information tool for researching for someone like me. So from this, I can tell you that at the time of the battle, Christian Shriver was growing in his fields wheat, rye, Indian corn, oats, hay, and clover. In addition, he was also growing Irish and sweet potatoes and was selling his excess produce at market gardens. Now, as a wealthy farmer, Shriver had a substantial investment in livestock, owning $1,055 worth of animals, which was almost double that of the average farmer. So these details tell you a lot about his income, his wealth, his production. That's a huge amount of livestock for this time. Now, as the days ticked closer to the start of the Battle of Gettysburg and the troops inched ever closer to the town, the Shrivers were going about their daily routines as they had for the past 16 years, not knowing the calamity that was about to befall them. Now, what I'd like to do here, we're going to just talk a little bit about what was going on June 30th, on the 1st, on the 2nd, on the 3rd, and after the battle. So for the Shriver family, like I said, this is great because I got a lot of firsthand accounts on this one. On June 30th, pretty much they knew what was coming. They knew the armies were heading toward town. Word of impending danger began funneling from citizens near and far. As the troops inched closer and the realization of what might happen began to take form, the Shrivers began to prepare for what might happen. To prepare for the worst, Christian Shriver actually sent one of his best horses 3 miles away to the farm of his father-in-law, Isaac Fisher, over in Freedom Township, with the hope that it might be kept safe. A lot of people in the area on the 30th and on the 1st took their horses and got their horses out. A lot of them were taken over into York County because obviously you did not want the armies taking your horses. Horses were high value property and they were worth a lot, and you would be in deep trouble if you didn't have your horses. Okay, so after he brought the horse to his father-in-law in Freedom Township, the family made other small preparations. But not the Shriver kids were kind of excited. So, these are young boys, so the excitement of the battle was just kind of too much for them. And they wanted to explore. They wanted to see what was going on. So on the evening of June 30th, knowing that portions of the Union Army were just down the road from their farm, Jacob Shriver asked his mother if he could go out to see the soldiers. He was 16 at the time, so, she gave him permission, said, "Son, be back before dark, I'm sure." But so he went out. But Jacob Shriver didn't see just any soldier. He happened upon General Reynolds and his staff. The First Corps commander gave a pass to Jacob and told him to give it to his mother and father. The pass was for admittance into the camp the following morning, and attached to the pass was a request for provisions for the general's breakfast and that of his staff. When Jacob got back home that evening, he delivered the pass to his parents. Now, General Reynolds, as we know, or if you don't know, was actually encamped along the Emmitsburg Road, somewhere about a mile out from the Moritz's Tavern. You always hear of Moritz's Tavern. The Shriver farm from that location was about probably a mile and a half, maybe 2 miles. So it's probably a mile. So it's in an easy walking distance for him. Interesting that he came across him. Okay, so early on the next morning, on July 1st, 1863, the Shrivers took meat, potatoes, eggs, and bread to where General Reynolds and his men were encamped, approximately 1 mile north of Moritz's Tavern, as I mentioned, along the Emmitsburg Road. Now, as soon as they got there, Mrs. Shriver set about preparing breakfast for the general and his staff. After breakfast was finished, as the Shrivers were about to leave, General Reynolds offered Mrs. Shriver $5 for the provision in her work, but she declined to accept. This is, supposedly this is a first-hand story account, so I'm inclined to believe this one. I like it. But General Reynolds, so he tries to offer her $5 for everything, and she declines. And he really appreciated her good heart and therefore insisted that she take the money. She actually did end up taking the money from him. And midway through their conversation, word came into camp that the rebels were coming. This caused a huge stir among the troops, and the soldiers began their preparations for their move into town. Just a few short hours later, General Reynolds was killed in the opening actions of the battle. So it's nice or sad to say that Mrs. Alice Shriver had the honor of preparing the last meal that General Reynolds ever ate. The Shrivers left camp and hurried to the safety of their home before the troops could clog the roads. They weren't home very long before the Union soldiers started marching past their farm. Now, some of you may not know this, but Chapel Road actually became a main artery for 2 divisions of the 11th Corps. What they did is the Emmitsburg Road was all congested with troops marching into town. So 2 divisions of the 11th Corps were cut off and sent off to the east on the Chapel Road to connect over to the Taneytown Road and then march up the Taneytown Road. So these troops, shortly after they got home, started marching past their house. As the Shriver family watched the troops march by, with some men stopping to fill their canteens at the well in the front yard, they began to get an idea of what was coming and what the days ahead might bring. Now, later in the day, they had more visitors to their property. Christian Shriver stated that a portion of the Union Army, being a supply train, took possession of 2 meadows or fields of grass containing 12 acres and remained there until July 2nd, 1863, and used and appropriated all of the grass on the fields for their cattle and their horses. This little meadow, actually, I've been in this house. I've done all this research for the owners, and we were talking about, hey, where was this little bottom land, this little meadow? And it's right along Chapel Road, right across the street from where the house is. So it's really neat when you're standing at this house and you're standing on the front yard and you're standing by that well, to look out and you can just see the scene, because absolutely nothing has changed about the scenery in this area. It's just pristine. So it gives you goosebumps you can see them there. So by Christian Shriver's estimates, there were about 300 head of cattle, which consumed approximately 15 tons of hay that had been growing in the field. Shriver claimed that the damage to his crops and land was much greater than it might have been, owing to the fact that it was bottomland and quite soft from all of the recent rains. Meadowland grasses were often very made to be very boggy and wet so that the grass would grow thicker and lusher in that area. And just as an FYI, a little tip, if you had a lot of meadowland on your property, it was actually taxed at a higher rate because it was valuable land. So you wanted a property with a lot of meadowland. Now, sometime during the second day of the battle, the Union supply trains stationed in Shriver's fields hitched up their teams and left, most likely heading closer to town and the scene of the fighting to resupply the troops. Because the fighting on the second day of the battle was closer to their farm, and the sounds coming from the battlefield were louder or more distinct, and the reality of just how close they were getting to the scene of the fighting, it was starting to worry the Shrivers. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this property, though you've never, it seems like it's so far out, but as the crow flies, it's probably about 2 miles, I would say, from Big Round Top, maybe a little more, maybe 2.5, 3. But so it's close, and on day 2 you got the fighting going on along Little Round Top and around Big Round Top and Devil's Den. So the Shrivers definitely would have been hearing the sounds coming from the battlefield. A number of families in the area left their homes on the 2nd, as I mentioned this in an earlier podcast when we talked about the Spangler farm. July 2nd seems to be the day that everybody hightailed it for safer locations. Nothing was written about what the Shriver family did, so I don't know when they left. My guess would probably be around this time period as well. They may have decided to stay on a little longer since they're just a little farther south than some of the other farms. So they may have stayed on just a little longer. But no doubt, with young children and a baby in the family, don't forget that Mrs. Shriver had a baby. They were ready to go at a moment's notice should the need arise. Now, on the morning of July 3rd, the reality of just how close the farm sat to the main sphere of the fighting became reality for the Shrivers. Their farm, situated just south of the extreme left of the Union line, was close to the scene of operations of the Union cavalry, who were tasked with protecting the left flank of the Federal Army. So Judson Kilpatrick's troopers were in the area at the time. Around midday on July 3rd, his troops headed south down the Tawnytown Road to Rock Creek, where they went to water their horses in preparation for the fighting to come. And Rock Creek from the Shriver house was about a half a mile, so they were close. The Kilpatrick's troops then retraced their route north up the Tawnytown Road and turned left onto the farm fields of Shriver's neighbor just to the north, James Thompson. They rode parallel to the current-day Barlow-Greenmount Road, which at the time of the battle was just a dirt farm lane. And it was on the Thompson farm that General Kilpatrick's cavalry ran into skirmishers of the enemy hidden in the woods behind the Thompson house along Ridge Road. Now, this is very close to the Shriver farm. The Thompson house and where Kilpatrick's troops came in is less than a half a mile. So this is close. David Shriver and George Shriver, who were too young to join the service, decided that they wanted to be eyewitnesses to what was going on the Thompson farm. So they climbed a tree that was situated on the top of a large hill where they had an excellent view of the action. As they were watching the fighting, they couldn't help but wish that they were old enough to be down there helping. Feeling the excitement and thrill, you can just picture two young boys just wanting to put on, fire their guns. But feeling the excitement and thrill of the scene they were witnessing, they suddenly were brought to their senses when several shots went whizzing through the leaves of the tree they were hiding in. They became immediately aware of the danger they had gotten themselves in and had started to climb down out of the tree when an officer passed nearby. When he saw the boys, he shouted, "You boys, get down out of that tree and run home as fast as your young legs will carry you." By this time, the boys were so frightened by what they had experienced that they didn't need to be told a second time to hurry. All that afternoon, the Shrivers could hear the sounds of the fighting on the south end of the battlefield, and they wondered minute by minute what was going to happen next. Now, you can imagine, as a homeowner at this time, you don't know if the battle's going to move on to your farm. You don't know what's going to happen each day. Now, on the evening of July 3rd and through the evening of July 6th, as the sounds of battles had ceased on the 3rd and darkness fell, the Shriver farm became inundated with soldiers. Troops were all over the Shriver farm as well as all the neighboring farms, not only at the end of the 3rd day of battle, but also for the duration of the campaign. The Shrivers' new house, yikes, was filled with wounded and bloody soldiers whom they cared for to the best of their ability. They took their job of tending to the wounded very seriously, of course, hoping that their son Louis, who was also in the service, as I mentioned, would receive the same kind of treatment if he was ever wounded. The Shriver family was kept busy during the days of the battle and in the days following. Not only were they occupied with caring for the wounded from both sides in their house and in their outbuildings, but they were also busy helping feed the Union soldiers who came to the farm before and during the battle, and all of the wounded on the farm after the battle. Family legend has it that Mrs. Shriver's bake oven was not cooled off for 3 days after the battle, as she baked bread continuously for the soldiers under her care. Now, although the devastating course of events had changed the Shriver's life, how could you not get the picture of what had happened out of your mind, especially for those young boys? But you see what's taking place in your house and all the bloody and the wounded soldiers and what you had gone through. It probably took them a good while to regroup and get back into a normal routine. It had changed them. It had changed everybody. But they were fortunate. The Shrivers were very fortunate in that they were in a much better financial position to endure the hardships the battle had caused. Shriver was able to fix up his farm. He was able to replant his crops and carry on with his life without a great sacrifice. In fact, within 10 years, his wealth grew so substantially that it doubled, and he increased his real estate value to $20,000 in 1870, and his personal wealth to $7,700. So he was wealthy. Let's just put it that way. Disgustingly wealthy. In November of 1863, when Abraham Lincoln came to Gettysburg to deliver his address, 5 of the Shriver boys went to hear him: Henry, Jacob, George, David, and Solomon. The Shriver boys stood within a few feet of Lincoln, and David, later in life, stated that he remembered vividly how the president held his listeners absolutely enthralled. In May of 1864, one of Shriver's son, Henry Jefferson, was drafted into service to fight for the Union Army. He enlisted in Warren's Independent Company of Pennsylvania Cavalry on August 4th, 1864, and was mustered in as a private 3 days later. So the war continues on for the Shrivers. The enlistment was just for a short term of service, 100 days, but it was still service. The main mission of the short-term companies such as Warren's was to guard vicinities that were in need of protection. While a part of Warren's cavalry, Shriver was detailed for some time in the United States Signal Service and performed duties in that service in Williamsport, Maryland, and Maryland Heights, Maryland. Opposite Harper's Ferry. Shriver was mustered out of the Federal Army on November 30th, 1864, at the end of his term of service. Now, in 1864, Christian Shriver decided to hire a local lawyer, Robert McCreary, to seek reimbursement from the government for a horse taken by Second Lieutenant William F. Sands of the 4th New York Battery, which was part of the 3rd Corps. Remember earlier how I told you that in preparation for the battle, he had sent his horse off to his father-in-law's farm over in Freedom Township? Well, it got taken. Although he had sent the horse there for safekeeping, it got confiscated. A number of horses were taken by Sands from the Fisher farm, and receipts were issued to all of the owners. But unfortunately, since Sands, quote, was not authorized to take the horses, end quote, the receipts were deemed not certified and no compensatory damages were awarded. In another podcast, we talked about the damage claim process and how the government liked to make it as difficult as possible for you to actually get any kind of an award. So it was submit, kickback. In this case, he had a receipt, which normally you would think was excellent proof. He had the receipt in his hands, but oops, Sands wasn't authorized to take it, so nope, you're not going to get anything. It was a fun process. Christian Shriver continued to improve his farm after the war ended, and in 1866 he began construction on a wood frame house on the property. It's unclear what his intentions were for this house. The building remains today as yet another example of Shriver's wealth. It's a tenant house now, but I actually wonder if maybe he built it for one of his sons to live in. Unfortunately, wealth couldn't prevent the family tragedy that struck on September 26, 1873. On that day, the Shrivers lost yet another child, Benjamin, at the age of 13. Sadly, he had just celebrated his birthday 6 days earlier. Shriver continued throughout the years to enjoy the stature and prominence he had earned early on in life, and he remained active with the Mount Joy Lutheran Church and was once again elected church councilman in 1872 and 1875. In local politics, he got involved, and he ran as a Republican in 1879 for the position of Cumberland Township Assistant Assessor and won the seat just by a narrow margin. In 1874, Christian Shriver once again sought reimbursement for some of the damages to the property during the Battle of Gettysburg. He submitted a federal claim for the damage done to his fields by the Union supply trains, as we talked about, all the damage that was done to the fields. He claimed a total loss of $270, which included 12 acres of meadow land that was destroyed, 20 tons of hay that was taken, and in the same claim, he once again tried to get reimbursement for that horse that was taken from his father-in-law's farm. He valued the 5-year-old roan mare at $200. After much back and forth haggling on August 11, 1883, the response to Shriver's claim was finally received. Unfortunately, the news was not good. Like most residents of Adams County, his claim was disallowed because the Quartermaster General has considered this case and decides that he is unable to certify that he is convinced that the claim is just. So as I said earlier, if you wanted money back from your battlefield damage claims, good luck. In 1886, Shriver divided off a portion of his land and sold it to his son David. The 82-acre parcel he cut off was located on the southern end of the property along the Ridge Road. He retained the remaining acreage for himself and his family. In December of 1887, Alice Shriver suffered a freak accident when a window fell on her hand, seriously smashing it. Her hand was cut open in the mishap, and unbeknownst to her at the time, infection had entered into her bloodstream. On December 21, 1887, she succumbed to blood poisoning and died in the house surrounded by her family. So this just goes to show you in that time period how quickly an accident can turn fatal. On September 12, 1891, Christian Shriver sold the family farm to his son, George. Although he no longer owned the property, he continued to live there with his family. On February 16, 1893, George transferred the property back to his father, which is kind of an unusual thing. But I think that most likely what was happening was Christian Shriver was coming up toward the end of his life and wanted an easy division of his estate after his passing, which was why George transferred the property back to him. He had written his will just 3 days earlier, in which he authorized the sale of any and all real estate he owned, with the proceeds to be divided amongst all of his sons. On June 25, 1893, at 5:55 p.m., that's for my ghost friends, Christian Shriver passed away at the family home from heart failure. On April 2nd, 1894, his estate was settled and the property was sold out of the Shriver family to Jacob Waybright. In 1903, Jacob Waybright sold the property to his son-in-law, William Durborough, and his daughter, Annie. This was the start of over 100 years of Durborough family ownership, which continues to this day. And that is a very brief kind of a Civil War history of the Christian Shriver farm. And as I mentioned earlier, if you're interested in renting this house, it's for rent. And also be sure to check out my Facebook, Gettysburg House Histories Facebook page. I'll post some more pictures. I have a great picture of Christian and Alice that I'll share on there with you. And I look forward to talking to you about another house topic at our next podcast. Thanks for listening.